Welcome to the second part of our episode on visual signaling in our series Revolutionary Secrets, Cryptology in the American Revolution. In this part, we'll hear about a unique code used by the Culper Spy Ring. But first, some background. In the spring of 1776, General George Washington's Continental Army had suffered defeat at the Battle of Long Island, and by mid-September, his troops had retreated to Harlem Heights, north of New York City. He knew that in order to defeat the British, he needed to know the current status of British troops and supplies, as well as have foreknowledge of their intentions. He needed a volunteer to enter the British lines and spy. Nathan Hale agreed to go. What Hale actually did before being captured is unknown. However, he apparently gathered some useful information and wrote notes on scraps of paper. He hid these notes in his shoes. Hiding a message for transmission is known in the cryptologic world as steganography. Hiding a message in your shoe is perhaps not the cleverest of steganographic methods, but we'll get into those in another part of the series. In New York, Nathan Hale was arrested and identified. The incriminating notes were found on him, and Hale confessed to being a soldier in the Continental Army. He was immediately sentenced to hang without trial the next morning. 2 years later, Washington again sought information on British intentions in New York. However, after the failed efforts by Nathan Hale, he knew he needed a resident in the city. Someone who put on the airs of a loyalist would not stand out and could gather better information. Washington also needed a transmission route to get the information safely out of New York and into his hands. In the summer of 1778, Washington ordered Major Benjamin Tallmadge to create a spy network. Benjamin Tallmadge was born and raised in Suffolk County, New York. Tallmadge knew that losses like Hale needn't occur with embedded agents living in the city, and they could provide better information if well planned and executed. For his agents, Tallmadge turned to the neighbors he knew and trusted in Setauket, New York, and created the Culper Spy Ring. There were many members of the Culper Spy Ring who all played a role in transmitting intelligence to George Washington. The route, however, was rather circuitous. One spy, whose code name was Culper Jr., gathered the information in New York City. Even Washington didn't know Culper Jr.'s real name, but it was later determined to be a man named Robert Townsend. He was well placed to gather information on the British. He owned a store and was a silent partner in a coffee house visited by British soldiers. He was also known to write articles for the King's newspaper, Rivington's Royal Gazette, and British soldiers often told him things in hopes of having their name appear in the paper. The information that he gathered would then be given to a courier. Austin Rowe was the primary courier for the Culper Spy Ring. He owned a tavern in Setauket and often went to New York City to get supplies, so his comings and goings were not suspicious. If Washington had a request for specific information, Rowe traveled the 55 miles to the city to give it to Culper Jr. and returned later to carry the information back to Setauket. The information was often written in invisible ink and hidden within a stack of papers as part of Rowe's supplies, again to avoid suspicion. He turned his packet over to Abraham Woodhull, whose code name was Culper Sr. He had been the first of Tallmadge's neighbors to be recruited and originally had gathered information in New York City. But his temperament wasn't made to be a spy, and ever fearful of discovery, he eventually recruited Townsend to replace him in the city. However, he did continue to manage the ring from Setauket. After reviewing Townsend's messages and adding any other additional information he may have gathered, he passed it on to Caleb Brewster. Brewster had volunteered to spy for Washington before the Culper Spy Ring was even organized. He had been a whaleboatman before the Revolution and joining the Continental Army. In his free time, he'd take his whaleboat across Long Island Sound just to harass the British on the other side. So, it was natural that he be the choice to transport the Culper's intelligence over the water. Tallmadge, or a soldier courier, would then take the information back to George Washington. Clearly, this was not the fastest method of transport. Even though Washington valued the intelligence and knew that it was accurate, he complained about the time it took to reach him. In many cases, it was so late, it simply verified information he had received from other sources. In fact, the fastest request from Washington to Culper Jr. and back again took 10 days. How does visual signaling fit into this process? Anna Strong, who went by the name Nancy, lived on a farm in Setauket across from Abraham Woodhull's land. Sometimes she would ride into the city acting as a decoy for the man that she traveled with, because traveling with a woman made a courier less suspicious. However, her main purpose was to alert Woodhull when Caleb Brewster was in the area. Setauket has 6 coves in which Brewster could hide. No one knows how she knew when he was there or in which cove he was hiding, but Nancy's job was to alert the others. She did this through a unique signaling system. To announce that Caleb was there, she hung a black petticoat on her clothesline. Then she would hang a specific number of handkerchiefs. This would indicate in which cove he was hiding. The clothesline was easily in sight of not only Woodhull's farm, but also the road that the British routinely traveled. However, to them, it was merely laundry being hung out to dry. No one guessed that it was actually relaying information to a patriotic spy ring. The Culper Spy Ring supplied George Washington with a lot of information directly from the British throughout the remainder of the war, except for a few months when Benedict Arnold changed sides. But again, that's a story for another segment. I hope you enjoyed this episode on visual signaling and will join me for the others in the series of Revolutionary Secrets, Cryptology in the American Revolution. We will look at codes, ciphers, and steganography. Please join me.